There are dire warnings that New South Wales will be hit by increasingly extreme weather.
2015 was the hottest year since climate records began.
Figures show this July was the single hottest month in recorded history.
Australia sweltered through its hottest spring on record.
Climate change is now affecting every country on every continent.
It's the rate that's of great concern.
And what do you put that rate down to?
Oh, it's human activity.
We have everything we need. Some still doubt that we have the will to act, but I say the will to act is itself a renewable resource.
Hello and welcome back to Climactic in 2020. I'm Mark Spencer and I'm pleased to be introducing today's episode with a very special guest.
Hi, I'm Varsha. Thank you for having me today.
Absolute pleasure, Varsha. Thank you so much for joining me. Now, Varsha, you're known for a couple of things specifically, although I'm sure you've done a lot else in your still quite young life. You're a member of the core Sydney School Strike team, I understand, and also the national team for School Strike for Climate. And you've been a lead organizer of the Sydney School Strike since December of 2018. But most recently, you made news by making a mockery of the Prime Minister and many other members of the current government, and you rebelliously chose to score 99.15 in your ATAR exams. Now, what do you have to say for yourself?
Well, it's all pretty crazy. Like, I don't think I chose to score that at any point. Like, I wasn't expecting that at all. I think I was just really, really glad to have the climate movement as a part of my HSC experience, because I know that like 12th grade can be really, really crazy and just overwhelming. So it was great to have something that was a bit away from it, and it just felt like a massive community that I was part of the entire time, like fighting for climate justice. I think what it showed me though is that having a climate thing on the side really, really helped with studying and all of that, and it really helped shape what I wanted to do in the future as well, because now I know that I want to go into law and something political, and without the climate movement I definitely wouldn't have that.
Well, I'd be absolutely scared as a current politician knowing that a young person who not only spent so much of your time organizing for, I like the way you called it, that climate thing, but you were facing not only existential terror as a young person without, who's largely disenfranchised in society, while also scoring higher marks than practically anyone in government. That's amazing, and I think they will be looking over their shoulder for you. But also, you not only found time to organize for School Strike for Climate, not only in Sydney, but around the country, but you also took some time last year to be part of the Nancy Hillier Lecture at Parliament House. That took place on November 12th, and that's what you're going to be hearing later in this episode, listeners. But, Varsha, what was that experience like? Did that one stand out at all, or has it kind of just been part of the craziness that must have been this last year for you?
That lecture really stood out for me because it was right after my exams finished as well. So I was all done with the HSC and all that studying. And I think going to that one, I was just in that headspace to be like, oh, okay, I have the time and the capacity to fully think about what I'm going to say and how this panel is going to work. And the points brought up were really interesting because we had somebody from XR and then somebody from another person from School Strike as well. So that representation, and I think just interacting with somebody else from Extinction Rebellion was really cool because I hadn't really done much of that. So it was interesting to see their ideas and how our goals and objectives kind of collide, but they also diverge in so many ways. But at the end of the day, we're all fighting for climate justice, and some of the ideas that came up were really interesting, like how we're not just about climate action, but we're about justice for all, and taking care of our marginalized voices and making sure that everyone has a right to say what they want.
That's a really good point. This is a really nuanced and really engaging panel that really delved through a lot more layers than you normally get in a conversation about not only the climate crisis, but how the climate justice movement and how the climate sort of activist community works together, works in tandem, but also, what the friction points are and how to move past them and work better together. It's a really good point, Varsha, that this was after your exam, so that we're getting 100% Varsha, and you did amazingly in this panel. It was so good. Has anyone asked you this, actually? You got, over 99% in your exams while organizing this. In hindsight, could you have gotten like 97 and fixed the climate crisis, or?
I honestly, I really didn't expect 99 at all. I was expecting, I really needed mid-90s for my course, and I was super desperate for that. And that was kind of it, and I was like, I really hope, I wanted to do my best, obviously, but wild, so I can't even process my own ATAR, which is strange. But if I could have got a 97 and fixed the climate crisis, would have been stoked to do that, because, just the bushfires and everything lately. And even when we had the lecture that morning, we had a little snap action for the bushfires. And I think that was just so much more motivating to go on and speak about how important this crisis is and how we really need to fix it.
Yeah, very well said. And thank you for bringing us back to this moment, which, as we know, there's a lot of our fellow country men and women suffering immensely right now. And in saying that, we all have to just do what we can and from where we're at. And I think you're all going to get a lot out of this panel. And thank you so much for joining us to introduce it, Varsha. And to, just a few moments of your time is really appreciated. Now, just one quick light question before we get into it. If you could personally bring in anyone from entertainment, any celebrity, any big name into the climate fold, who would you convert to talking about the important stuff, Varsha, and why?
I feel like an actor or somebody from an older generation. I think that'd be really interesting, because I feel like a lot of our demographic that won't listen to us or seems to not care is that older demographic. I don't know, maybe Bon Jovi or somebody. Just turn all those people around and say, wake up.
That was a really insightful and smart answer, and I wouldn't have thought about that in a million years. You're completely right. You gave your answer to boomers. Thank you, Varsha. That was very, very conscientious. All right, now to hear even more insight and to enjoy the Nancy Hillier Memorial Lecture at Parliament House, here we go. Thank you, Varsha.
Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Paul Brown, and the first thing I need to do is present an apology from Kate Fairman, member of the Legislative Council, whose office here in Parliament House is the official host of this event. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone to learn that she was called into the House where there's a very serious and prolonged debate about the fire emergency and about the climate emergency. And here we are holding an event on the day of a climate and fire catastrophe, in one sense to demonstrate that it's quite okay to talk about those two things in the one event. So before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that we're holding this event on Cadigal land, the Cadigal of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects to the elders, past, present and future, and to acknowledge with gratitude that we are able to hold this event. Nancy Hillier was campaigning pretty much up to the moment that she passed away. I was with her in the last week before she died, and she was running a little campaign inside the Prince of Wales Hospital, where she'd been for several weeks, to try to get better facilities in the aged care section of the hospital. Nancy did that. She looked at what was in front of her, at the challenges that needed to be met, and she attempted to meet them, even in the last weeks of her life. She was an inspirational person. I worked alongside her for about 10 years when I was chair of the Community Participation Review Committee down in Botany. And at that stage we were dealing with what seemed like an intractable chemicals issue, the hexachlorobenzene issue, which is still not solved. And Nancy was an inspiration behind that campaign. But interestingly and importantly, and this is why we're here, Nancy Hillier founded in excess of 20 local organisations in an era where there wasn't even Meals on Wheels. And she took it upon herself to campaign across a wide range of social and environmental and political issues, especially in Botany Bay area. The lecture was set up to honour that memory, but the lecture was also set up to do something that Nancy was very passionate about, and that is to continue to explore activism and how and why people take on the roles of activists. Nancy was passionate about a particular question, that is, how does the baton pass from one generation to another? How do activists grow out of the grassroots movements and become motivated and inspired to take action and seek change? That's what this lecture honours. There's a few people here I'd like to acknowledge before we go any further. Clive Hillier, Nancy's son, is here. Thank you for coming, Clive, and you'll hear from him at the end of the proceedings. In a moment, I'll introduce Dorothy Rapasady, councillor from Bayside Council, who will welcome you on behalf of Bayside Council. We have Jem Rommeld here, who gave the Nancy Hillier Lecture last year. Welcome, Jem. And we have University of New South Wales students and staff. We have university people from other universities and people who are involved in the Botany Historical Trust. And we have Nancy's friends and colleagues who've come, and quite a number of people who have come because they're interested in the topic. And I do need to acknowledge at the outset that this event is supported by the University of New South Wales and Bayside Council. Our program for the night goes a bit like this, that after Dorothy has spoken with you, I'll ask Temma Milstein, who's going to chair the panel, to bring the panel up onto the stage, and the panel discussion will go for approximately an hour and a quarter. That includes at least half an hour for questions from the audience, and please get those ready. You'll hear from Temma that she wants this to be a conversation, so prepare to ask questions. With nothing more from me, I'd like to introduce and thank Councillor Dorothy Rapasady.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'd just like to start by acknowledging that this event is being held on Aboriginal land and recognise the strength, resilience and capacity of Aboriginal people in this land. On behalf of Mayor Councillor Joe Awada and Bayside Council, I would like to thank you for inviting me to be here tonight. I think everyone who lives in Bayside, and even Sydney for that matter, should know about the late Nancy Hillier, the amazing person that she was and the work that she did for the community and the environment. I think it's safe to say we would not have the Sydney that we do now if it wasn't for her tireless work and passion. Bayside Council is proud to continue honouring the former botany activist by hosting the annual Nancy Hillier Memorial Lecture, organised by the University of New South Wales. Council is committed to commemorating the life, work and passion of Nancy Hillier through this annual lecture. Local governments are faced with many social, environmental and economic problems, and we cannot solve them without community input. Nancy was a very special person. If she saw injustice or felt that government leaders were making a mistake, she did not hesitate to say so. And if they didn't listen, then she fought them on the streets and in the courts, and she just never gave up. Some of her most vocal campaigns were involved with the expansion of the airport and Port Botany and fighting for the environmental survival of Botany Bay. As I reflect on her achievements, her passion, her kindness, and her tireless campaigns, and there were many, big and small, I have no doubt that she would have been a formidable force in the current Port Botany cruise ship terminal debate. This is a debate that I believe, personally, has gone about in a little bit of a strange way, and particularly opening up such a prolonged community consultation period as part of the strategic planning and the detailed planning for the strategic business case, I feel, or I worry personally, is an attempt to induce an attention fatigue in the community. So I do believe that Nancy Hillier, one of the lessons that she gives us tonight is that we mustn't give up, we mustn't get complacent. And by the time that the environmental impact statement, which is where the real meat of the environmental impacts are reviewed and discussed, that we're still pushing for our voices to be heard on this matter and that we don't get that attention fatigue. The title of this year's lecture, Climate Justice, New Community Activism, is very appropriate. Nancy was not afraid to stand up and share her wisdom and her knowledge, and neither should we. Her work is an inspiration for any resident wanting to get involved in community issues and the decision-making process. We can all learn a lot from Nancy's approach, and I'm very pleased that Bayside Council and the University of New South Wales is now introducing Nancy Hillier to a much wider audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. And now it's my very great pleasure to introduce to you the panel of speakers, starting with Temma Milstein, who's going to be the chair. Temma comes from the University of New South Wales. She convenes the Master of Environmental Management, and I'll let her tell you a little bit more about her own background. Jean Hinchliffe is one of the prime movers behind the School Strike for Climate campaign and has a long experience with that campaign. Even though you're in year 10 of high school. Varsha Yajman has also been working in that campaign. She comes from Gosford High on the Central Coast. And Ellie Baxter is a communications specialist who has been working with Extinction Rebellion. So I'd invite you all to come to the stage and set up for the panel.
Thank you for coming, everybody, and braving the heat. So I'm Temma, and then we have...
Hi, I'm Jean.
Hi, I'm Varsha.
Hello, I'm Ellie.
And we're going to try a different kind of format so that we're not talking at you so much, but instead really engaging in dialogue and then creating hopefully a space for a lot of engagement in our Q&A that follows on the panel. And the way this is going to work is we're going to start youngest, go to oldest. So we'll start with Jean, and each person on the panel is going to be more of a conversation starter than a presenter. So Jean will talk for about 5 minutes about some key points that are really meaningful to her in terms of activism. And then she's going to end that with a question that she poses to the panel. And then we'll all engage in dialogue about that for about 10 minutes. And then we'll move to Varsha and do the same. And then we'll move to Ellie and do the same. And after we've gone through and had that dialogue up here, we'll open it up to everyone here. And the goal with opening it up is not to put forth particular campaigns, but really to start a conversation. So if you could start to think in terms of not comments as much as questions, so that we're constantly having conversation emerge in ways that we might not have expected when we came in today. So we'll start with Jean.
Great. Hi, I'm Jean Hinchliffe, and I'm 15 years old, and I founded the Sydney group of School Strike for Climate and maintain as a lead national organiser, and I help organise internationally. My family and myself really aren't the activist type. My parents have really instilled a sense of social justice within me, but they were never really organisers or participating that much. And sort of my first step into activism was when I was 13, and I was probably the youngest volunteer with the Vote Yes for Marriage Equality campaign. So that was involved with a lot of calling people up randomly, and everyone thought I was like 20-something or whatever. And I thought that was very important as a 13-year-old. And yeah, after that, I did a little bit with Stop Adani and Get Up. But yeah, it's just late last year, a little over a year ago, I got a text from a friend and there's a link to the School Strike for Climate website. At that point, Greta had a little bit of notoriety. The school strikes were really small and no country had ever held a big strike. And it'd been set up a few days prior from a few girls in Castlemaine. So I thought, oh yeah, I'll come along to an event in Sydney. And I saw there was only an event in Melbourne being planned, so just right away I jumped in and said I'd organise one in Sydney. And that first rally we were expecting if we did really, really well, we might get 1,000 in Sydney. And we ended up with 5,000 and 15,000 nationally. And then March 15th, this was the first time we'd ever had a globally coordinated strike, which Australia actually played a really major part in making that a global effort. And that time around in Sydney, we thought we wouldn't publicise our goal because we thought we wouldn't reach it, but we thought 15,000 would be insane, and we got 30,000. And then September 20 came along, and we thought, totally crushing it, we get 60,000, and we ended up with, I think, 80,000 people, and 350,000 nationally, and that was... and across September 20 and 27th, globally, there were about, I think, 11 million people participating in strikes across those days. And in my opinion, what's made this movement grow so much in such a short period of time? It's a couple major things. And the first is that we remain strictly non-partisan. And this means that we're able to frame this issue as not something that's an inner city issue or a left-wing issue or a right-wing issue. It's a human issue. And it's not politics at this point. It's a crisis. So we're campaigning for bipartisan efforts. We're not saying that any particular party would favour or anything of that sort. We just want climate action, meaningful climate action, to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming. And the thing that I think has been really big is that we're changing the way that the climate change and the climate crisis is discussed. Because for decades now, it's been an issue dominated by scientists. And you see all these reports and these studies and the statistics, and it doesn't feel like a real world issue. It just feels like numbers on a page. And it feels like a distant thing and something you don't need to think about until the next century. It's really easy to disassociate yourself from it. But when you have young people being the main voices in this conversation, yes, we follow to the science, but what we're doing is we're changing it and saying, this is how it will impact me. I think I'll be 26 when the 12 years we had to avert the worst impacts of the climate crisis will be over. And at that point, I'm at the very beginning of my life still. I will be experiencing enormous droughts, bushfires bigger than what we're seeing at the moment. We'll be seeing flooding, we'll be seeing food shortages, all these major issues. And I'm lucky. I'm living in a first world country. We're in a privileged position. If you're looking at it in developing nations and low-lying Pacific regions, these people are literally losing their homes already. This is an issue happening right now, and it's only getting worse going into the future. So what we've done is we're able to frame it as this real-world human issue instead of being a graph, or instead of being, this is how much sea levels will rise, or these are how many species will go extinct, because that doesn't feel urgent and it doesn't feel pressing. We're really relating to people's emotional sides. And I think that's helping a lot in increasing the urgency of this. Another thing I wanted to bring up is throughout this campaign since the beginning, we always hear as organisers that we're such remarkable young people and that, oh, you're so special for doing this. But what I've noticed is that, honestly, any of my friends at school could be taking action in the way that I do. And they're able to do this. This isn't an exclusive thing. Anyone is able to make these major changes. The thing is that, particularly as young people, we're told time and time again that we're too young to make a difference and that we don't fully understand the issue and that we're ignorant or apathetic and that our voices don't deserve to be heard. Honestly, that follows through into adulthood. And I think most people feel that they are powerless and that they don't have the skills needed to take action in this way and to lead these campaigns. And I just want to say 100% everyone does. And the fact that you're here today, you probably have that nagging feeling that I should do something or you want to get involved. And it is scary, but sort of reaching that point where you just go for it and you say yes to an opportunity and you do what you can and help in any way. People love that. And these are the most accepting communities. And you're able to reach out for help, and really anyone is able to be involved in these, and this is a space for everyone, and we need everyone for things to really change. So that was my little ramble. Oh, I forgot to put a question forward. Yeah, I guess the question I'd put forward is, I think that, as I was saying, we've changed this conversation. It's feeling much more urgent. And already we've had decades of this science coming in. This is a clear issue. And people are seeing it as an issue. But what I sort of pose is, at what point do we think it will reach a stage where voters and politicians are willing to put this issue above all others and see this as the number one? Because that's what we need for this to really change.
Okay, I'll start. So I think it's the economic drive that really puts politicians in their place. So I think at one point when they finally realized that coal is so expensive in comparison to renewables and that it's not sustainable, or not even the sustainable bit, in fact. It's more about the money that we're getting and how we're a coal-thriving country. I think once they realize that renewables are going to be cheaper in the long term and short term, that's the only time that we're actually going to get a change. And I think that's one of the main missions of School Strike, of all these amazing climate movements, is putting forth the idea that it's not just about being a bunch of people who are like, yay, we're hippies and we're like fighting for the world. It's not about that. It's about the idea that this does affect us financially, it does affect us socially, and it is affecting our health. The bushfires today are absolutely insane, and I think it just goes to show that it's really about educating people at this stage, and that's what we have to do.
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree that it will be an economic driver, 100%. I think they already know. You'd have to be very, very ignorant of the world's realities to not see that renewables will be cheaper moving forward. I think the point at which we'll start to see change is when we see the mining companies and the mining lobbies extricated from funding our government, which is what they're doing at the moment through political donations.
Cool. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what so you're representing two movements up here that are making headlines, that are really affecting people's views, that are really, I mean, I have some numbers here from the United States and from Australia in terms of how people are being affected, for instance, by youth-led climate protests. So now over 3/4 of Americans indicated that the youth-led climate protests make them feel hopeful about climate action, including 28% very hopeful. And that same majority indicates youth-led protests make them feel motivated, including 27% very motivated. So that's quite new. And in Australia, in September, the Australia Institute found that 81% of Australians believe climate change will result in more droughts and flooding. 2 out of 3 agreed the government could plan for an orderly phase out of coal. 64% of Australians said we should aim for net zero emissions by 2050. So can you talk just a little bit? Some people will be really familiar with the demands of the two groups and the goals, but maybe we could hit on those a little bit to create more basis for what we're talking about here.
School Strike for Climate, we have 3 main demands, and that is no new sources of fossil fuels, including the Adani mine. The second is full renewable energy and exports by 2030. And the third is for a just transition and job creation for all fossil fuel employed workers.
Extinction Rebellion's demands are fairly the same across internationally. Some areas have included a 4th demand, but generally the 3 demands are tell the truth, which it calls on governments at all levels to declare a climate emergency. The second demand is to act now to bring emissions to net zero by 2025. And the third demand is beyond politics. And that means establishing a citizens' assembly to make the decisions on policy about how we get to net zero, so that we're taking that decision-making process out of the hands of governments who are simply there for their next re-election and giving it back to the people.
Great. Can we add to this why it's important for governments at the federal level and at the local level to be declaring a climate emergency? What does that have to do with these overarching goals?
What we've seen, for example, if we look at the example of the City of Sydney, they've recently gone completely carbon neutral in all of their operations, and they've declared a climate emergency. So it's about putting that line in the sand and declaring this is what we know to be true, and from here we will act as if it's true. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what are your next goals in terms of councils? I mean, I know that some people might know that last month at the federal level here in Australia, a crossbench motion to declare a climate emergency was blocked. I know that there are, I mean, it's passed in the UK, it's passed in Canada, and it seems to be having some effect in terms of how politics are starting to play out. Should we be acting locally? Should we be acting federally, both at once? What are the best approaches?
I absolutely believe that we need to be acting at all 3 levels concurrently. The Local Government Association passed a climate emergency at their conference recently, which was a fantastic step. So absolutely lobby your local councils, but we also obviously need to be working at a state and federal level, and this is a global issue, so at a global level as well.
Do either of you want to add anything about it?
Well, I think it's just really interesting the way we're using language now in this movement. So we've gone from climate change, we've gone from like global warming to climate change to climate crisis to climate emergency. And I think it's about understanding how those words play a part in our movement and how they create that sense of urgency and that tension in the environment. Because I know that lately we've been using the phrase climate crisis or climate emergency just so much more. And on the strike of September 20th, the energy was so different. It's so different to any other action that we've ever had. And I think the reason for that is because we have that tension, we have that urgency. So I think that's also a really, really great drive to get our politicians to kind of come around to the economic bends, I guess. And yeah, I think that's just a really great way to catalyze a change.
I think it's all about providing that sense of urgency, because climate change and global warming, it's sort of like, they sound like faraway issues and they don't sound like right here, right now, we need to do something issues. And when you're saying that something is a crisis or an emergency or ecological breakdown, these are terms which they show the scale of the crisis that this is. You see things like the bushfires going on at the moment, and that isn't climate change, that's a climate emergency. And I think providing that distinction has really helped in people's understanding of it, and also drawing that link between major disastrous weather events like those going on right now and climate change itself.
It's on the tip of people's tongues
Yeah,
now, right? When people are talking about the smoke, it's what comes right after that is a discussion about why. Yeah. Varsha, do you want to? Yeah.
Okay. So, my name is Varsha Yajman. I'm 17. I just finished year 12, so yay. So, I just want to give a bit of context, I guess, about how I joined this movement. So, I started in AYCC, which is the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, at the start of last year when I was in year 11. And basically, I did a little student climate leadership program thing. And that was completely run by university students. It was run by people who were fresh out of high school, who had a really different perspective, I guess. Because, like Jean was saying, this issue can just seem so far away, can seem so distant. And I think especially our education syllabus doesn't really do it much justice either. We don't really learn anything about it that actually makes us feel empowered or motivated to make a change. So I started in AYCC, and then my family is it's quite supportive of it because they've done social justice things, I guess, years ago. But I think there's also the idea of our education being hindered, the amount of time I spend on this movement versus the amount of time I spend at school. And I think that was a real clashing conflict in my family, and I think that's the case for a lot of people out there. It's about, how am I going to find time to balance everything? What role do I have as a student? Am I just a person who studies and goes to school, or am I actually taking part in social issues? Am I making a change? Am I looking at long-term goals that I have in life as well? And I think that was something that took me ages to figure out. I probably haven't yet, but I think I realized that these movements and these issues are just so important to me that I do want to take them into my career, and that I do want to pursue them in the future. It's not just something on the side anymore. And I also found that when I joined AYCC, and also School Strike for Climate late last year, or early this year, in fact, this movement was dominated by women in a big sense. And I think that's really, really empowering, because being a female, being a teenager, you're kind of told girls can't do this, girls can't do that. And even though we're a little bit more progressive nowadays, that stigma is still definitely there. And I think it's just amazing that this movement is able to kind of transcend those constraints and be okay, we have an objective, and that objective is to have a sustainable future. And that sustainable future doesn't segregate based on gender or race. Even being a person of color from India with an Indian ethnicity, I've never felt hindered in this movement, or I've never felt discriminated against, and I think that's one of the most amazing things about the climate movement. But it's also made me think about, what is the climate movement? Are we a bunch of lefties just, out there? Or are we thinking about just a sustainable future? Are we thinking about other social issues? What role do we have in society? Because I think for me, I've realized that it's more than just a sustainable future. It's about bringing people together. And I think on September 20th, that really showed me that 350,000 people coming together and saying that we believe in the same thing, that we're going to forget about our gender, we're going to forget about our race, that there's this one objective that we have, that, we're bigger than our politicians in a sense. And I know it can kind of seem demotivating at times when we see our politicians just kind of ignoring us, and I think that's been happening for years now, because Stop Adani and Get Up have been doing so much of work, and I think this is the first time that we're actually seeing some acknowledgement, because I know that when I turn on the news every night, climate change is always a debated issue on there, and I think the reason for that is because young people are stepping up. It's because we're saying that we're not just students who are going to go to school and do the HSC and do these exams, but we're going to take part in social issues, that we're going to look after our future, that there's more to us. My kind of question is, what role do you think the climate movement has in society? Is it about empowering females, or is it about changing what a student is? Is it about changing our titles as human beings? What do we have in this? Why are we doing this?
I think that's a really great question. And it's something that we need to think of with a level of complexity. One of the strategies within Extinction Rebellion is to be very, very single-minded about addressing the climate crisis, that we are in an emergency, and not to allow ourselves to get distracted by other issues, which are extraordinarily important, but in the face of extinction that we have to be a little bit single-minded. Having said that, one of our core values is to have a regenerative culture, and that's really about it's about a whole lot of things, but in this context, one of the things that it's about is creating a vision of the culture we want in the future and how the climate movement can be a part of creating what will be the new system that grows out of whatever's left of this system once we hopefully get through the crisis. So I think that's a really interesting question, and it's something that I personally struggle with, to find an appropriate balance between recognising that we are in a crisis and we need to be taking emergency measures, whilst also maintaining those values and the importance of justice. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the climate movement over the past couple of years has really started pushing for the sense of, instead of just climate action, climate justice. And that means sovereignty for First Nations people. That means workers' rights. That means LGBT rights. That means all these different issues, because it's that sense of intersectionality. And I think that's what's really been shifting recently, because when you look at these issues, they are so interlinked. And you can say, if you're looking at LGBT rights, LGBT people are far more likely to be homeless in their youth, and when climate change happens, you have these extreme weather events, it is the homeless who are the most impacted. And then, so that's just like quite a simple sort of example. But I think that within society, it's sort of shaping that idea that we can't have really meaningful climate action without justice for all peoples. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to think about justice for all people. I think that kind of sums up what a movement is, because it's not just about one thing, because I think it's important to have one objective and one main goal. I think that's great because it brings a lot of people together, but having that diversity and that openness and saying that it's about more than just this one thing, I think it brings together so many more people, and it makes it a mass mobilization that it is today. And I think that's how it's going to gain more attention, and that's how it's going to get bigger and possibly catalyze a bit of change in politics as well.
Again, though, it's definitely difficult. Like what you're saying, you need to head first with this is an emergency, we need to value this most, and then, but also balancing that within other values. It is a really complex thing, and finding that balance is impossible, but it's sort of, it's difficult, but I think a lot of different movements are really finding that right now.
Of course, and I mean, the thing is, I think it's important that we don't say, action on climate at any cost.
Yeah,
that's not acceptable. It can't be at the cost of marginalised people. It can't be at the cost of the global south. It has to be climate justice, absolutely.
I like that you brought up intersectionality, right? Because the interlinking of all of the isms, which some of my students are in this room when we've talked about that this term, the interlinking of colonialism and racism and sexism and anthropocentrism, right? The human-centeredness to the exclusion of the more than human world is all interlinked, right? The same traits that are used to others, those who we see as others or those who society positions as others, are used in all of those different situations. So by starting to work on this major part of the fabric, right, this part of the fabric that we're all literally breathing in and out of, I think it's going to have an evolutionary effect. I'd be really interested, Ellie, in you talking a little bit more about the regenerative culture aspect of Extinction Rebellion, especially because I know that Extinction Rebellion gives regular regenerative culture workshops that are open to anyone who wants to attend, and also that there is a regenerative framework for the activism itself, a regenerative cycle that has a great diagram and is seasonal and cyclical and quite interesting. Can you talk about what happens at those workshops and how the activism is also regenerative?
Yeah, of course. The Regenerative Culture 101 workshop is kind of based in a sort of earth-based psychological well-being methodology. Those are not the proper terms. I'm not in the Regenerative Culture Working Group, but I have attended one of the workshops. And it's very much about connecting with earth emotions. So, for example, we do an exercise where people in the room are guided to feel whether they feel most like earth, most like air, or most like water. Then one element is asked to walk away and turn their back on the rest of the group. And then we talk about how that felt and how you would feel in our group. Earth walked away. How did you feel when the earth turned its back on you? And really connecting to, as you say, the more than human world and that experience. I found that quite profound. The Regenerative Culture Group, they run workshops like that. They also are our wellbeing support people at Actions. They do arrestee support after Spring Rebellion, they sat outside police stations all night with snacks and hugs and support for people when they were released. They're also very engaged with, checking in with activists, and all of us have a tendency to take on too much and get burnt out. So they're fantastic at checking in with us and also putting in place measures within all of the other working groups where at the beginning of a meeting we all check in about where we're at, how we're coping emotionally, how we're coping with our workloads, how we can support each other. And that's a really inbuilt part of the movement, because we know it's never going to be just one action. It's never going to be, Spring Rebellion's done, great. We're in this for the long haul. We know that we're going to have to keep fighting for a long time.
So if someone in this audience who's not involved yet in either of the movements or in both of the movements wanted to be, for instance, in that group, how would they
join the regenerative culture group? The first step would be to come to a Welcome to the Rebellion talk. They're held every Thursday at the Gaelic Club in Surrey Hills, 6:00. Just rock up. At that talk, you'll be led through some of the basics of the science, and then a bit about how Extinction Rebellion operates and what the demands and our core principles and values are, the strategy behind the movement. And from there you can put your name down on a list to be part of the Regenerative Culture Working Group, and hopefully, if the system works, someone will get in touch with you and invite you to a meeting.
Awesome. And so that's 6 p.m. every Thursday?
Yes, at the Gaelic Club
in Surrey Hills. Okay, great. Thank you. 6:30. Okay.
If you get there at 6, someone will be there.
Biscuits, etc. Okay, wonderful. Ellie.
Yeah. My name is Ellie Baxter. I'm 37 years old, and I finished high school quite a long time ago. But I'm enormously proud and honoured to sit beside these young women who are doing really, really incredible work. And I really hate to use the word inspiration, because it's like, no, we should be doing this because it's the right thing to do. But you ladies are very inspiring. So I think the most useful thing I can do is talk more specifically about Extinction Rebellion, for those of you who don't know about the movement. It started in the UK. They kicked off their main public event in October of 2018. But before that, there had been about a year to 18 months of a group of people who came together who were activists and academics who wanted to put together a strategy for a movement that would really push things forward in terms of action on climate change. And they relied on some interesting research. One of the studies they looked at was Erica Chenoweth's study out of Harvard that looked at the success of social movements. She went into it believing that uprising was the most effective way of creating change, and through her work was quite surprised to discover that, in fact, non-violent direct action was the most successful strategy in terms of creating a social movement. What she also found was that in the situations she studied, which there was a bit of a bias towards countries that weren't liberal democracies, so we're yet to see how this will play out in a liberal democracy, but in countries that weren't liberal democracies, where 3.5% of the population were engaged in sustained civil disobedience, they always succeeded in overthrowing a government. So that's pretty inspiring. Again, it's not a perfect methodology, but it's interesting. And from that, they worked to develop what could be a global movement. And I think you just have to look at the name to see how incendiary they're willing to be. Will you choose extinction or will you choose rebellion? Those are very specifically chosen words. And I think that they're very important and powerful in terms of how the movement is seen and how it sees itself. From there, they held the first declaration of rebellion in London in October of 2018, which was a great kick-off but relatively small. And where they really came into their own was the uprising in London in April of this year, where they essentially shut down London for 2 weeks. And at the end of that action, 1,000 people had been arrested, and the UK's Conservative government declared a climate emergency. And that was the point at which a lot of people who were interested in taking action on climate internationally looked at this model and thought, yep, let's give that a go. That seems to be somewhere where we can see a way forward. There's a couple of things that I think have been particularly effective. Firstly, the arrests have been a very powerful strategy. Again, it's not a straightforward strategy. There's a whole lot of issues, particularly around privilege and marginalised people, choosing to be arrested as comfortable white middle class person for a very minor charge is pretty straightforward. If you don't hold that level of privilege, it's not straightforward, and we absolutely acknowledge that. But it is a very effective way of getting attention, and that's certainly what we saw here in the Spring Rebellion in October rather, that, you know, we had 40 odd arrests and it was headline news for a week. It's absolutely changed the way the media is talking about climate action and really brought around this sense of urgency. The other thing that I think is different and effective is the use of theatricality and creativity within the actions. I think when people see them, obviously some people think that we're raving lunatics, and that's fine, but a lot of people see beauty and they see emotion, and look, it's not fun, but I think it's something where you see people doing it and think, that's interesting and I'd like to be involved, in a way that goes beyond perhaps just participating in a march. And I think that's been really effective. And the movement has been extraordinarily well branded. I think just the impact of the hourglass symbol, the language, has been very effective. What do you see as the differences and also the synergies between Extinction Rebellion and School Strike?
Great question.
Hi, this is Holly Hammond, Director of the Commons Social Change Library, with a resource recommendation for climate activists. Extinction Rebellion and other creative rebels have brought non-violent direct action to the forefront of the national conversation. The Commons has gathered 55 resources on non-violent direct action, including videos, podcasts, articles, manuals and more. You can find resources on the theory and philosophy of NVDA, practical guides to setting up action groups and blockades, training materials, many inspiring and informative case studies, and specialist resources on legal rights, safety and resilience. Visit the non-violent direct action topic on commonslibrary.org. The Commons is your one-stop shop for resources for community action.
So, School Strike for Climate, from what I've noticed, I think the focus for us is getting every single person out on the streets coming to a giant rally and march. Whilst we're definitely not playing by the rules in that we are striking, we're skipping school, now we have so many adults skipping work to join us, we never really go for arrests or that sort of really direct form of action. And I think that it's great having both movements, because it means that you have that space for that really direct form of action that some find extreme, but is really important and has a really vital place in the movement. And you also have a space for people who maybe aren't as comfortable in that, but want to be part of these, want to make a difference and want to be part of these mass mobilizations. So I think that's the place that School Strike plays in this, whereas Extinction Rebellion is less about getting every single person involved, but more about getting the people who really do care and who are willing to get arrested or who want to get involved in these more direct forms of action and having a place for them as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I very much see part of XR's role as being about the leading edge of moving the Overton window. You know, that we're willing to push out a little bit further, and that makes more room for organisations like 100%. The School Strike.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's been interesting because seeing the initial School Strike, and which was November 30, and discussing with... I was at Newtown Festival, and that was the first sort of promotion I'd done for it, and I had a stack of maybe 150 flyers, and the rules there are that you can only give someone a flyer if you have like a conversation with them and they choose to accept it. And I got through all of them in the day, and I remember it was very difficult to convince kids that yes, you're allowed to skip school for this sort of thing. You just need to bring a note in from your parents and you should be allowed, or like maybe you can skip one exam, you know, this is like really important. And that was a really extreme form of action, and politicians were debating. You had ScoMo's comments about more learning in schools and less activism, which, just a little tangent on that. We were growing quite a bit before November 30, but after Scott Morrison made his comments about it, we exploded as a movement.
Thank you.
The next day, I had CNN calling, I had BBC, I had SBS World News, SBS Normal News. all in like a 2-hour period. And over those next 2 days, like our Facebook response probably tripled, and the amount of people actually showing up exploded. And the thing is that because Australia were the world leaders for those strikes, we were the first country to ever hold a strike, and so many countries took action after we did. That means Scott Morrison played a vital role in the growth of this movement, and I love that. Yeah. Oh, what was my original point? Yeah, but leaders making comments like that, like going on strike, was this heavily contested issue, and that was one of the most extreme things people had done in the environment movement for such a long time. Like, we weren't playing by the rules. And then Extinction Rebellion go up, and they, particularly in Europe, after they shut down London for 2 weeks, that was just insane. And now striking is seen as, whilst it's still seen as super important, and so many people are getting involved, instead of being something that's up for debate whether, oh, should people even be doing this, it's like, this is an accepted part of the movement. No one is playing by the rules anymore. And I think Extinction Rebellion has really helped, as you're saying, like pushing that and making that space for us.
Yeah. Striking's gone mainstream.
Yeah.
Everyone's doing it.
I think for me, I found the difference between Extinction Rebellion and school strike to be the idea of parental consent, because we kind of live off of that. I'm going to be honest, that's basically our main thing, to get parental consent at this point, because if parents aren't letting their kids go, we're not going to have anyone there. That's the basis of our movement, is having people there and having that kind of collective visual of, whoa, 80,000 people, clearly our politicians should do something. It's that kind of idea. And then even for me, I know my own family's been like, oh my God, like, are you sure you're in year 12? Do you really want to skip this? You have the HSC exam in 2 weeks. And it's been a lot about kind of convincing them and grappling with that idea. But then I think when you move into Extinction Rebellion, you have that sense of autonomy, not only because of your age, but because of the experience. I feel like being in Extinction Rebellion, it's a bit of a different boat. I think you come in with a little bit more knowledge maybe, or a little bit more like understanding of why we need to be a part of this. Whereas with school strike, I know even when I joined, it was a bit of like I care about this issue, but then I'm sure I care about other issues as well. But then with school strike, you become so immersed in it. You meet all these people and you understand that climate change is something that you can actually do something about. And I think that's really hard for teenagers who are going through puberty and like with crazy stuff as well, to kind of realize that. And I think school strike is really great at facilitating that idea. And I think Extinction Rebellion kind of grows upon that, and it's kind of like, okay, how can I get more involved? Is it taking more of an aggressive stance? And I think that's where Extinction Rebellion and school strike can really work together.
Although there's definitely been such a shift in tone, I think, with young people.
Yeah, exactly.
I know, as soon as that UN report, which gave us 12 years to avert the worst impacts of the climate crisis, came out, it was, everyone saw it. And it's everyone's number one issue at this point, because every other human issue is something that, whilst we should be dealing with it, you can wait a few years and you can still deal with it. It isn't irreversible. Whereas the climate crisis, we're on the verge of that tipping point of runaway climate change. And at that point, even if we stopped all emissions, well, the Earth would keep heating and the seas would keep rising, and we couldn't do anything at that point. It is totally irreversible. And even right now, we've reached that tipping point and we're already having irreversible impacts. So I think we're really seeing that now.
Yeah, and even with the language again, like eco-anxiety, that's such a big thing now. And I think with these movements, we're trying to tranquilize that fear. And I think that's why it's so important to join these kinds of things, to understand that, yes, we have anxiety, we have eco-anxiety, we're horrified, we're terrified, but there is a way to kind of go about it. There is a way to manage this fear and understand that you are making a change, that you are making a more sustainable future for not only yourself, but for everybody else as well.
The strategies behind both movements and the tactics that you're using, in part, are helping people move from everyday people, right, to activists at a massive scale. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how your tactics and your overarching strategy, based on this being unlike anything we've ever dealt with before as a species, right? When we're all linked and networked in the ways that we are, knowing that this is overarching, it affects everything. In many ways, the movements are borrowing from some previous movements, right? I mean, such as decentralization. But there's also some things that are really new. I mean, having movements started by kids, right? So can you talk a little bit about what you think is most effective in terms of what you're borrowing from those activists who came before you, from the shoulders that you're standing on, and what you're introducing to this unique moment?
Yeah, I think school strike, it's really interesting. Actually, just a little story. I went to New York for Climate Week in September as the UN Youth Summit and the UN General Assembly was going on at that time. And I was talking with a university student who I think worked for March for Science. And he was so curious about the school strike movement. And he was saying, it's almost hilarious. We're so textbook in how our social movement has come together and in how we're operating. But we don't know any of the textbooks. Because he was asking me, what theory of change, who are you following? And I'm like, we're not following anyone. The way that we're doing this is, as young people, we're having these conversations. We're saying, what will be most effective? What will be our next step? And we have such a diverse range of people, and we have such a diverse range of views that when everyone has these conversations, we're able to consistently find the best option. And yeah, I think that in saying that, though, we are borrowing even groups like Stop Adani. In Sydney, at least, we've recently been setting up these sort of decentralised local action groups within different electorates so that we can really put pressure on different members of parliament. We're sort of borrowing from that idea of mass mobilisation and how we're growing through such a variety of means. But I think what really makes us different is that access to the internet. Because what's happened now is that we're able to globally coordinate these events, and we're able to have a global unanimity in this is what the events are like, these are our messages. And we're able to have calls, even though they're at 4 a.m. with kids in Europe and America and Asia and Africa and all over the place. And even internally, we're able to spread things through social media. And it's interesting, actually, because not only is it being spread through our strike page, which I think is...
More than 20,000 now.
No, we're nearly at 50,000 followers.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah.
Yeah, and not only are we spreading through these pages which have a big following, but what we've found actually makes it grow the most is when kids see that, screenshot it, and post it on their personal stories, personal social media pages, because it means that other kids will see, this kid from my school is going along, or this person in my friend group's going along. I won't be alone in doing this. Or, I can go with that group. It's because it's really scary when you're alone in doing this. And I think that the internet has totally changed how we organise. We never have in-person meetings, really. We're able to have this coordination, and I think that's one of the really big things which is differentiating us from pretty much anything that came before.
So Extinction Rebellion is a decentralised self-organising system, which basically means if you want something to happen, you do it, and you find other people to help you.
And just to be clear, that's true for anyone in this room. So if anyone here wants to make something happen.
Yeah, as long as if you go to the website and you read the 10 principles and values, and I've gone through the 3 demands, if you act following those principles and values and calling for those 3 demands, you can act in the name of Extinction Rebellion. It's extraordinarily open. There are no leaders. It's really, as I said, a self-organising movement. In terms of what has come before and what we've learned from, obviously we've looked at the history of non-violent direct action, and that's been a huge inspiration. But one of the things that's different about this crisis in terms of non-violent direct action is that there isn't a front line. So, for example, you could look at gas-field-free Northern Rivers and what they did at Bentley, where they had thousands of people blockading the site of a proposed CSG mine, and they won, bought back the licence. And that's a very distinct front line. That's where you go. So Extinction Rebellion's strategy is to say, come to the capital cities, come to the centre of commerce and business, and disrupt business as usual. And it gets back to that idea of interrupting the flow of money. It's when it hits the capital, money capital, not city capital, that politicians will really start to pay attention. Once you get to the point, for example, where you're shutting down the centre of London, that's shutting down one of the major finance centres of the world. And that's where you will see action on something that's so global and amorphous, where there isn't a front line.
Fantastic. I think it's a good time to open up for questions from everyone who's gathered. I think we have about 45 minutes left. I don't know if you have the mic, Paul, Matt, and Declan. Thank you. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. And we want to start with a woman.
Thank
Thank you. Hi, I've got a question, and that is around when you talk about shutting down the Centre of Commerce. What is anything being talked about with School Strike or Extinction Rebellion around Scott Morrison's desire to prevent people from doing something as simple and, in fact, as capitalist as boycotting an organisation for their role in our extinction crisis? Are you allowed to talk strategy? What we can do to resist that particular demonstration of control and coercion?
So I feel like with us, it's kind of innate to our movement in terms of like partnerships and things like that, and how we go about representing other organizations and how we want our message to be spread. Because there's obviously some organizations that are amazing, they're very ethical, and they're also very supportive of what we're doing. And I think those are great for us to kind of go along and say, okay, we want to work with you, or we want you to spread our message and we'll give you something in return. But in terms of other organizations that they're probably really popularized, which is great, and it does get our name around, but at the same time, they're not really going with what our main basis is. Like, they probably are using a lot of coal energy and that kind of stuff, so they're not really on the renewable side of things, or they're not really in support of climate action, but rather getting themselves out there and saying that, oh yeah, we're with these young lefties who want to do things. And I think it's just, for us, it's really about differentiating that. And that's how we kind of attack the capitalists.
I think within School Strike, I think fortunately for us, not much of our campaigning has been centred around boycotting, but the thing is that is such a integral part of the environmental movement. I think campaigns like Stop Adani, it is so vital to it. It is so core to it. And right now, honestly, we're still coming up with strategies and discussing exactly how we want to approach that issue, because it is very real. And if things do change surrounding how we can boycott, that will totally shape and it will totally change how we have to go about activism. And yeah, I think that honestly right now we haven't totally outlined exactly how we will be approaching that, but I think that a lot of different environmental groups right now are having conversations surrounding it and sort of how we can oppose that, because that is part of it's a basic freedom. It's important that in these forms of activism that we're able to disrupt the economy and we're able to create positive change through the system in which is causing these issues.
Yeah. I think what Scott Morrison is suggesting is thoroughly undemocratic. The idea that you can prevent boycotts, like, they're going to force me to buy stuff I don't want to buy. I don't think there's a legislative mechanism that can really do that, which is not to say it's not a concern, because obviously there are other ways of cracking down on organisations. But, I mean, in terms of our strategies, we're still targeting companies, absolutely. We were outside the BHP AGM last week demanding that they step back from being a member of the Minerals Council of Australia, which is the 8th most damaging for the climate lobby group in the world. And they had a really great result inside the AGM. 27% of shareholders voted, or 28% voted in support of that motion. So we're hopeful that as a long-term strategy, they will pull out of the Minerals Council. And as the biggest mining corporation in the world, that would be a huge success. But yeah, look, let's do some GHD sit-ins together.
Yes, 100%.
I think it's also a bit trickier for us in terms of like economic disruption, because we do have such a young demographic as well. So it's a bit hard to kind of get kids, I guess, into that idea of, boycotting this and boycotting that. Because I know when I was really little, advertisements are kind of everything. They could put something pink on the TV and I'd buy it. It's just that idea of finding how to really grapple with young children's minds and that idea of boycotting.
And also, particularly as teenagers, we don't have much financial independence.
Exactly.
I can't tell my parents to switch banks because, I could try, and I'm still trying. But I think that it's interesting actually seeing how different groups approach that, because by that same token, though, I know the Australian Youth Climate Coalition and School Strike also have had discussions surrounding really targeting businesses, because they play such a pivotal role in this crisis. And it's difficult because, particularly with School Strike, our tactics are having these enormous mobilizations, and at this point it's around like once every 6 months or so. So when you're having these enormous things, we're normally targeting on a federal level because there is so much to cover. So I think part of School Strike's strategy going into the future is figuring out having these sort of smaller, more targeted actions and sort of how we can coordinate that along with these really enormous mobilizations. Yeah.
Thank you. More questions?
I'm just noting that everybody on the stage is female, and I don't know whether that's simply accidental or whether there is something in this crisis that particularly appeals to women.
I think, okay, because this is something we've been trying to figure out since the school strike movement began, because from day one it has been totally female dominated. And no one knows 100%. No one is 100% agreeing on it, but my personal take is that I think marginalized peoples tend to be the ones who will sympathize and empathize with these issues and are more likely to take action. And I think due to patriarchy, females are in a system of oppression still. And I think because of that, they are more likely to be the ones taking action. And I think it's not just women. Like, you look within these movements and there's a lot of queer people, there's a lot of racially diverse people, there's a lot of disabled people, there's all these different issues like that. And I think that just generally marginalized peoples are always the first ones to take action on any issue.
I also think that I completely agree with the whole marginalized voices, but I also think that there's this idea of like Mother Earth, and it's always been like a very feminine thing almost, in a sense. Like, I think the idea of nurturing and like that showing tenderly love to nature, it's such a romanticized idea. And even when you look at like all this poetry from the Romanticism era, that kind of thing, it's very female heavy in a sense, and it's that very like elegant and that kind of idea. And I think that's one of the reasons that females are so drawn to this in a sense. And I also think that that's something that's changing, because I don't think that romanticist idea is still there. And I think it's definitely going to even change more in the future. But I mean, if I'm just going to guess, I'm going to say that, because it's such a big thing to say Mother Earth, or like describing the oceans in a very feminine manner. So yeah, that's all I can say.
Yeah, I think Extinction Rebellion is probably closer to parity of genders, although thinking through some meetings, there's often more women than men. And I really agree with you, Varsha, about the characterization of Mother Earth and a sense of a feminine energy around the environmental movement as such. I was thinking about what motivates people to engage in the climate movement, and I was looking at some of the things that people have said to me in XR, and it's people have an existential fear, or they talk about wanting a future for their grandchildren or their children, or people my age who are struggling with the idea of whether or not they should have children given what we're facing. And I think what is at the heart of every single one of these motivations is love. It's about love for humanity, love for the world beyond humanity. And I think women are socialised to be more connected with that feeling than men are.
That is something we're all changing, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
All the men in here and all of us raising men, I mean, moving from the dominator patriarchal approach, right, to the caring and partnership approach is part of this regenerative culture shift.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Something that worries me is the potential for nominally apolitical climate movements to be combined with far-right nationalism. How do you see the climate movement intersecting with nationalism, for good or for bad?
As in like nationalistic, like Australia's great kind of nationalism?
Yeah. So far right, like...
Okay.
I think that the thing about, not that we're apolitical, it's more like non-partisan, because I think there is a distinction between that. We're just saying we won't ever support any party, really. We're just supporting this sort of policy. But I think something about the environmental movement is that it's not about saving yourself or saving your own country, because it doesn't work if just your country or just one space take action. It's all about a globalized approach. And every step of the way, it's that globalization. And even with the Paris Agreement, we all need to do our bit, really, to keep this below a severe amount of warming. And personally, I just see that I can't see them intersecting that much, just because when you're valuing your nation or your place above all others, I think that inherently just doesn't work with the notion of the climate movement and the values that are upheld just generally within it.
Yeah, look, I think as the movement gathers steam and more support, and it begins to be less seen as of the left and more of surviving, I think it is a genuine danger that the movement could be co-opted in a sort of eco-fascist direction. I also think there are ways that the movement can benefit from a sense of maybe healthy nationalism. If you look at the book that Ross Garnaut has recently released about how Australia is really in a position to be an economic superpower based on renewable energy, that's a kind of almost positive nationalism that we could be tapping into in terms of might be something that might convince our political leaders to move in that direction and away from fossil fuels and into renewables. But I do have a genuine fear that, as I said, as the demographic that is attracted to climate activism widens, that we have to come back to that not at any cost mentality and be extremely cautious of any form of action that doesn't enfranchise marginalised communities.
I think I've actually seen the climate movement step away from the nationalism. I feel like we're saying our country's not good enough, in a sense.
Yeah.
So every single time, because our politicians are the one like, Australia's doing so good, you know, we're really up there, we're doing so much. And then it's like, no, we're third largest exporters of coal, but that's fine, you know? And then we're telling our politicians that, no, we're not doing enough, that Australia has so much more potential. And I know it's the same in the US, it's the same in India, it's the same in Sri Lanka, it's the same in all those countries. They're saying that, okay, no, our politicians are not doing enough. Our country is not doing enough. We're not anywhere near the standards that we need to be. So I think the only people who are really instigating any sort of nationalism are our politicians. And I think right now with most of this movement, we're kind of against our politicians in a sense. So I don't really see them clashing too much.
Ellie, I'm very sympathetic to your cause and I'm totally supportive of what you're doing. I just fear that your strategy might be sort of a bit counterproductive in terms of, you know, if you think about the current government's in for another 2.5 years, we're talking about action needed to be taken straight away. So short of Jean and Varsha's generation coming through and becoming the ruling class, which is going to be a while off, you sort of think, well, how can we get things changing more quickly? And your strategy of disrupting business, disrupting people's commute to work and so on, I think runs the danger of just pissing people off. And if you look at the strategy that a lot of people are saying that the way that things will change will not come through politicians, it'll come through business. And it's going to come through business because it's going to affect their bottom line. And once business realises that their bottom line is going to be impacted very negatively if they don't address climate change, they do change. And if you think that business is going to be the driver, if you look at the US, it seems that business is driving action rather than governments. It looks like, at least in the short term in Australia, the same is going to happen here. So if you look at getting business offside, I fear that your strategy might backfire. And if you look at what a lot of the superannuation funds are doing, they're talking to businesses and outlining to them that they think they would be better off if they addressed these issues. And
excuse me, do you have a question?
Yeah. My question is, have you guys thought about getting together with business rather than pissing them off by boycotting them? Because that's what a lot of the super funds are doing, and they've got a lot of money behind them in terms of voting out the boards and so on. So
thanks.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I acknowledge what you're saying. I don't think that's the role of Extinction Rebellion. It's a multifaceted movement. There are amazing organisations that are doing that work, like the Australian Centre for Corporate Responsibility, Market Forces, 350. They're all doing that sort of work, and it's extraordinarily important. I think, as I said earlier, what I see the role for Extinction Rebellion as being is pushing out and creating more space behind for those more mainstream types of action. Look, it's something we hear every day. You're just pissing people off. You're turning people away from the movement. And what I would say is, first of all, you would never have heard of Extinction Rebellion if we weren't in the streets pissing people off and getting arrested. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that there was a really interesting bit of polling done by Essential Poll 2 weeks ago. It was 2 weeks after Spring Rebellion. They did a poll of over 1,000 people. 41% of those people knew of Extinction Rebellion, and of that 41%, 52% supported what we're doing, including 27% of coalition voters. So I accept what you're saying, that it pisses people off, but it also inspires people. I think seeing people in their 70s being dragged off streets by cops in black really puts us in the moral high ground. And yeah, there will always be people like Kerry-Ann Kennelly who will say that we should be used as speed bumps, and that's fine. That's fine. It's putting us in the headlines. It's offering us the opportunity to say, this is where we stand. You know, we're willing to make these sacrifices. And it puts the question to the public, what are you willing to do?
Great. Thanks all so much. And this actually leads off from your question of putting it to the public and what are you willing to do? And a really kind of lovely, both like frustration and excitement that I've heard from all three of you tonight is kind of around this idea of the hero story, that there's one inspirational individual who's kind of behind this, or just a couple. And with both of your movements, there's a real emphasis on kind of spreading that around. And I think, once people get a taste of, okay, this is my agency, I can actually do a thing, then, that's a pretty amazing transformation. What I'd love to hear from all three of you is, how do you get someone from that, say, like a non-activist identified person like myself most of the time, how do you get one of us to actually get in and get that taste of really feeling your agency and your ability to organise and to do something when we do have that story of this is just individual remarkable people, the rest of us, we're just listeners, we're not going to join the call to action?
I think it's a combination of things. I think firstly, when you have things like the strikes, because the first one was more like kids who really care about climate change, and then from there it's become more and more mainstream to the point where on September 20 we had 80,000 people in the Domain. And I remember my little sister saying how she'd leave early, and I'm like, just stick around for the march. And she's like, oh no, don't worry, I already did the first march. Because that's how many people were all flooding in. And these aren't people who are already activists. Most of the time, for so many of the people, it was their first ever protest or their first ever march. And I think having these enormous mobilizations, having people come along, firstly, I think that helps. Because just sort of knowing, like, okay, this is what this world is. This is what I could potentially get involved in. And then I think the organisations themselves have a bit of a duty for running sort of educational sessions. And School Strike, during our summer holidays over Christmas after the November 30 strike, we actually held a sort of 2-day training camp type thing with the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. And we had a wonderful activist called Amanda Tattersall. She's a co-founder of Get Up, co-founder of Sydney Alliance. If you Google her, you'll see a giant list of things she's a part of. And she's an amazing organiser. And from there sort of held this training session on different organisational structures. And we had school strikers facilitating at different tables, and kids would come up with ideas that we could really actually use, and then they'd start up little community groups, and from there we now have a monthly cleanup crew. They'll go to parks or beaches and things like that, and that's just sort of a fun way for everyone to meet each other. And then we've had a bunch of other actions actually stem from that. So I think that really does help. And on top of that, we had things like after March 15th, we had the Climate Election Town Hall, and that was in collaboration with, again, the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, along with Stop Adani. And it was open for adults and kids, and everyone came in. We had a bunch of really awesome, inspiring speakers, and then we separated off into, I think it was under 30s, or maybe under 28, and then 28 plus, and then from there divided into areas and started different community action groups. So I think it is our job to help facilitate that and find ways that people can really easily get involved. And otherwise, it always becomes a thing that is too daunting and is really difficult. But I think on top of that, when we do have these enormous mobilizations or these really inspiring things, then people sort of feel that drive, and then they'll Google us and see how they can sign up to our newsletter or sort of somehow get involved. So I think that also does help a lot.
I think for me, a big thing when I came into this kind of climate activism field is the idea of being an activist. I think we're starting to break that terminology almost, because what is an activist? I think I'm just doing my duty as a human. This is what I should be doing. This is what I think most people should be doing.
It feels like too much of an official label.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just existing, and then I'm thinking about my future, and I'm thinking about the future of my family and my friends. Isn't that what we're all supposed to do at the end of the day? So when I first joined this movement, I remember it was like a 6-hour day, and it was with the AYCC, and I was like, oh my god, this is way too long. What am I going to do in this time? But I realized that this movement isn't about learning about all this sciencey and like strategic stuff. It's about socializing. It's about meeting people who are like-minded. It's about understanding why we're fighting for this issue in a collective manner and why we can't just do it by ourselves. But it's also about understanding the agency that we do possess. So I think that's what this entire movement means, and that's how it kind of came about, and that's how it's progressing now.
So my journey sort of into the beast with Extinction Rebellion was, I joined the Facebook page, didn't really know much about it. And then I saw someone saying, hey, does anyone want to join the media and messaging working group? And I was like, yeah, I work in media and messaging. I've been doing that for most of my career. I can do that. So I think what's great about XR is whatever your interest is, be it your professional interest or your hobby, there's a place for you. If you want to join a choir, if you want to join the arts group, if you want to be in Regen, if you want to be in talks and training, there's so many different options. You can be in IT, you can be in finance. I know, sexy, huh? But there's so many different ways in, and yeah, as I said, it can be about your career, it can be about your hobby, it can just be about something you want to learn more about, and finding that way where it's something that you really want to be doing. We don't want people there to be, grudgingly. We want you to be there because you're lit up by it and you're doing something that you find really inspiring and you're learning something new or developing your skills. Yeah.
As a quick follow-up, just practical follow-up to that, you mentioned going to websites, signing up for the email list, joining the Facebook pages. What are some other practical steps people can take just to get involved if they're not already?
All of those things. There's a discussion group, there's a Sydney discussion group, there's a New South Wales discussion group. They're both excellent. As I said, there's an intro talk every Thursday at the Gaelic Club at 6:30. Come along to that. That's a really, really great way to get a sense of what everyone's like, which is really friendly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's mostly online for us, actually. As I was saying, all of our organising is online. It is so rare for us to do anything in person. There's people within the movement who organise for the Sydney team that I haven't ever met in person. So honestly, it's just sort of, right now we're still figuring out exactly how adults can support. Often when it comes to strike days, we always need marshals, we always need volunteers in that sense. But yeah, honestly, just online, we have a space where it's just sort of sign up, you can say if you're an adult supporter and what skills you have and how you can help. And from there, we'll put you forward into your local group or direct you to the people who you could work with and who could really help out.
Yeah, I think sometimes for us it's actually a DM on Instagram. It's like, oh, I live in this area and I want to be a part of it. And then we're kind of moving people around and seeing like our teams and different electorates and stuff like that. So it's quite easy in that sense.
And are there next actions you want people to know about that they might want to be involved in or support?
Okay, so this, I think, is being announced tomorrow.
Yeah, so a little preview.
Yeah, you guys are first to know. Okay, so on November 29th, that's the next sort of big global action with the strike. However, since it was so close to September 20, we decided as the Australian movement not to make that our next major strike, rather another form of action. And we had a plan and then decided to scrap it yesterday. In light of the recent bushfires, we just felt that we wanted to do something a bit bigger. So we're holding a bunch of different, we're calling them teach-ins. So we will be going to different MPs' offices. We'll bring whiteboards, textbooks, the whole shebang. And we will be, in probably a rather condescending manner, sort of pointing the finger saying, this is a crisis, do your job. And we want that really interesting visual of having all these young people there. And I think right now we've got a call after this where we'll also be discussing the role of adults within that. But everyone's welcome to come along. And yeah, it seems like it'd be a really great action that would be happening nationally. Yeah, so we're looking like we will be announcing details soon, but it's looking like most likely going to be Scott Morrison's office.
Yeah, maybe
Gladys's as well. We're just sort of looking around at the moment because we have a lot of people interested, of course, to sort of how far we want to reach, but definitely targeting ScoMo because he's been extra suckish lately.
Yeah, sure has. I think also a big thing with this is that we're trying to get a bit more like widespread, I guess, and not just school students. So anybody's welcome. We just really want to reiterate that because although we are School Strike for Climate, we're organised by students, but we do want to make sure that we're inclusive.
Yeah, so just sign up to our website. You'll get details soon.
We're holding a bushfire vigil on Friday afternoon at 5:30 outside Town Hall. That will be a very obviously sombre action. And then on Saturday, we're having a picnic at Redfern Park. If you jump on the Facebook page, all the details will be there. And that's just a really nice social activity, just a chance to come along and meet some people and see if you vibe with our vibe.
Great. So I think we're going to stop the panel and create some space for people to have one-on-one conversations afterward and maybe have a little bite to eat. So thank you, panelists. You're fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're only a couple of minutes away from finishing the formalities, but before that I'd just like to introduce Clive Hillier, Nancy Hillier's son. Thanks, Paul.
First, I'd like to thank everyone for coming along this evening. I mean, this is the fourth evening and they keep on getting better and better. I think we have a big vote of thanks to Paul as the driving force to getting this all happening and making it happening, so I'd like to thank Paul personally for his help. And I'd like to thank our wonderful, inspirational is not a word of choice apparently, but I think they're very inspirational. They're absolute apathy killers, and I hope ScoMo's scared because he should be. Couldn't see it happen to a nicer guy, but anyway, that's another story. I was talking to Paul earlier about activism, and like when Mum got into this 40-odd years ago, she started off in a fairly small way, but she found out she's hitting barriers all over the place. And it's mainly with the pollies who didn't want to know about it, they couldn't see what was in it for them. And unless you push the right buttons with the politicians, which comes down to money and votes, they're not going to give you any attention. And these guys are right on the money with that. And the money's the key word. You've got to hurt them where it hurts. They've got to be worried about their seat at the next election. They've got to worry about the people thinking they're basically good people and they should be voted for. So then they'll start to follow a cause if there's something they think it's in it for them. They're pretty egocentric. A bit cynical these days about politicians, but anyway, I don't think most people are. One of the things I believe, and I think Mum would have as well, is activism starts at home. She started in a small way in a small suburb of Botany over issues of pollution in the area, the way the area has been mistreated, the way it was let run down, how nobody cared about it, how the big industries walked all over the place. And she started out as an independent activist. Her original group that she formed with the Delaps was the Botany Independent Action Group. And the word independent was important to them because they didn't want to think the people to think they were in anyone's pocket with the politicians. They didn't choose sides, but they certainly chose allies. The people who are prepared to support them, you foster them, you don't push them away. But by the same token, you don't let them buy you, and that's critical. Something that concerns me at the moment is we need to look at the big picture. That's really important. But I think we still need to look in our own backyards where we have issues, where we're being walked all over by governments and big industries who really only look at the dollars. And if we don't jump up and make a noise about it, it'll continue to happen. And it's from these little seeds that are being planted in the communities where we are opposing things. And what I'm alluding to here is the cruise ships coming into Botany Bay, which I feel I'm very strongly against. I mean, it's a short-sighted planning or lack thereof. I mean, we've got these massive machines that contribute more sulphur dioxide than any other machine on the planet coming into Botany Bay, which is very little that's left as it was when Captain Cook came here and the original inhabitants owned the land. You look around the bay from Kurnell, where Caltex was, and what's left of it still is, coming round through Brighton on the other side of the bay, we get to the airport with the runways into the bay. The dredging, I remember the dredging that went on for that, the disruption, the change of the ecosystem when that all happened. This is sort of things that Mum was against. Round to the port development, which destroyed that side of the bay as we knew it. It was dredged, the environmental system was destroyed. It not only affected this side of the bay, it affected the other side of the bay, around where the mangroves and things were from the dredging. There was a massive disruption. And now they want to go to that little jewel that's still left on this side of the bay, where we have La Perouse, we have Bear Island, we have Yarra Bay, and they want to anchor these massive cruise ships there. Come on. I mean, really, it's a disgrace. And it's so short-sighted. I mean, we've all seen industries like this come and go. I mean, cruises are a fad. Another 10 years' time, people have done that, and they may not be interested in doing it anymore. What are they going to use the port for then? What are they going to bring into the port? This is what they're not telling us about. And this is the stuff we've got to be on top of in our own little area, our own patch, to support the environment ongoing. And if everyone looks after their own patch, it's like a brick wall. All those little bricks add up, and you end up with a much better result. And hopefully the politicians will sit up and take notice. It's 6 years since Mum passed away this year. As Paul said earlier, and he sort of stole my thunder a little bit, she was on her deathbed still trying to bargain for the little guy. Her last words she didn't want to go because she had too much to do. And it's such a wonderful thing to see these young people coming through. And I'd like to thank you for your attendance tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. You've been listening to Climactic, the flagship podcast of the Climactic Collective, a podcast network dedicated to lifting the voices of the climate community. You can find out more about the people behind Climactic and all the shows we produce at climactic.fm. We are a social enterprise podcast network, and we greatly appreciate your support. You can find a link to our Pozible where you can support us directly in the show notes of this episode or from our website. Thank you for listening, and from the whole Climactic Collective, keep up the great work and take care of each other in these climactic times.
The Climactic Collective.